Okay, so the first element of the negligence suit is duty of care. Okay, the defendant owed a duty of care to the plaintiff, and it's based upon a very simple idea. Okay, and we can see it on this slide. We all have certain rights, okay, and it is our duty to not violate the rights of others. So I'm going to use an example. If you're walking down the sidewalk, do you generally have a certain right to be able to walk down the sidewalk safely and not be concerned about being physically hurt by a person or maybe a person's dog or something like that? And the answer is yes. Okay, those are a general right that we have as everyday American citizens. So when someone comes along and violates that right or takes it away from you, they have breached your duty of care. Okay. So the plaintiff, the person suing, must prove that the defendant, okay, the person being sued, violated their obligation to use a reasonable standard of care to prevent injury to others, okay? Reasonable standard of care. That is what the court is going to need to figure out. Did somebody, typically the plaintiff, do something or not do something, lack doing something that a reasonable person would do that ultimately resulted in the plaintiff having their rights violated? So a very easy to understand example would be taking your dog for a walk. Now, typically, if you're going to take your dog for a walk at a public place, you have the dog on a leash. But say that there's a person, they take their dog for a walk and they fail to leash the dog and the dog bites another person walking down the sidewalk. Well, that person that got bit, they had their right violated by the owner and the owner's dog. Okay, so that is an example of duty of care. So breach of duty, we sort of looked at this on the previous slide, but simply put, if you broke your duty of using reasonable care in dealing with another person. Okay, so using our prior example of the dog biting another pedestrian on the street, the failure to leash the dog would be the breach of duty. Okay, the reasonable person would say, if I'm taking my dog out for a walk, there is, a potential likelihood that the dog may act up and not like somebody and potentially bite them. In order to prevent that, I'm going to keep my dog on a leash. Okay, so the reasonable person standard comes into play. What a reasonable person under similar circumstances would do. The court would probably look at this case and say, well, a reasonable person would keep the dog on a leash. The defendant, you failed to do that, so we do believe that your actions were not reasonable and it resulted in a breach of your duty of care to the plaintiff. So now the third element that needs to be proven in a negligent suit is proximate cause, okay? So it is not enough to prove the defendant's actions were unreasonable, okay? That's not enough. Even if we prove that, failing to leash your dog in a public place was unreasonable, we need to go a step further, okay? The plaintiff must also prove the action or behavior was a proximate cause of the harm, okay? Was it a direct result? Well, in our example, it's a very clear yes, okay? My failure to leash my dog was unreasonable, and because of that, the dog bit the plaintiff and caused bodily harm, okay? There's a proximate cause there. There's a direct relationship. Okay, what the courts are going to do in order to determine whether something was proximate cause or not is they're going to apply a foreseeability test. And what the court is going to ask is, was the injury to the victim foreseeable at the time of the negligent conduct? Okay. In our example of the dog biting the pedestrian, the answer probably would be yes. One could foresee that or predict that something like that could potentially happen. Okay. Let's take it a step further and maybe illustrate how the foreseeability test may fail. So the dog lashes out at the pedestrian gets bit, falls backward, and something rolls out of their hand onto the street. Maybe it's maybe they were carrying their groceries and it was a can of soup rolls out into the street as a car is coming by. And the car, the person driving the car swerves and hits a mailbox. Okay, so now the person whose mailbox was hit, do we think that the court would be able to apply the foreseeability test to the owner of the dog who bit the first person? The answer is probably no, because a series of events happened that really weren't foreseeable, that connected the dog biting the first pedestrian to another pedestrian swerving into the mailbox. Okay, it's a chain of events, but it's not proximate. It's not really close. This thing had to happen before this thing happened, before this thing happened. It wasn't foreseeable. Something like that could not be easily predicted. Okay? There needs to be a direct link between the action of the defendant or lack of action and the damage caused to the plaintiff. Okay, now our fourth element that needs to be in place for a successful negligence suit is actual harm. Okay, was someone injured, was property destroyed, or was money lost? If not, then the biggest mistake will not result in negligence. Okay, so let's assume that we used the same example that we've been using of the dog not on a leash biting a potential pedestrian on the street. Well, let's say that everything up to the point of the dog lashing out at the pedestrian was the same. Okay, they weren't on a leash and it lashes out. But say that the dog lashes out at the pedestrian walking on the street and the pedestrian is able to lunge backwards and avoid getting bit by the dog, okay? And they don't sustain any sort of injury. Well, then that person they won't be able to file a negligence suit in court. And why is that? Because that person didn't have any actual harm incurred. They didn't get bit. They didn't sustain any sort of bodily injury. So even though the person walking the dog without the leash was negligent, okay, they breached their duty of care because the person, the potential plaintiff, did not get bit, then there was no actual harm and therefore there can't be a true negligence suit. Somebody had to have been injured or their property had to have been damaged or money was lost in order for there to be a successful negligence suit. Okay, it doesn't matter how big the mistake is. If somebody doesn't get hurt in some sort of way, then no actual harm has occurred.